Levi Ritter, according to the the City of Plattsburgh website, was sworn in here as an officer in April of 2004, and you were appointed as the chief of police in April of 2018. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so you reached out to me about doing this interview, and I thank you. After we put a video out talking about some of the recent unrest and how it relates to the relationship between the community and local law enforcement. And so over the last couple days, I've collected questions from community members, and we're going to just kind of have a conversation about those things.
Perfect.
So one of the uh, one of the main things that people expressed was asking for some sort of statement on the murder of George Floyd, and along with that, people are wondering why, thus far, the Plattsburgh City Police Department hasn't really spoken on issues like this before.
So my personal statement, and I obviously speak for the Plattsburgh Police Department, is that the the incident involving the arrest of George Floyd is really, really troubling. It's troubling for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a murder. He, the former officer Chauvin, uh, that's a criminal act by every calculation. I don't know what more to say about how horrific it is to watch that, other than it's horrific. It's shocking. Uh, as to why there hasn't been any official statement from me, it's probably not a great answer. My answer is, the last thing I want to do is seem opportunistic. And I watch a lot of things out there, and it seems like there are some entities are using this for some sort of social or political gain. I guess I underestimated how I felt, how people would expect me to feel, but that was the point that you made in your video that really caused me to reflect on what you were saying, and that I do understand that people would wonder, is this something, by my silence or my lack of a statement, that I somehow support this, or I just don't want to rock the boat or anything like that. And that's not the case. That's why I asked to speak with you, so I could make a very public statement about that.
I appreciate that, and I have seen. I even at the business I work for, where staff are saying that maybe it's irresponsible for us not to say something as as community members and as a community-owned business, when so many people in the community are looking to have leaders and organizations uh, show where they stand on things. So, I guess the other thing I want to follow up with that is, do you find that there's a difficulty, or what is your take on speaking as an individual, but also speaking as the chief of police as well, as representing other officers in a way, whether that's whether you actually represent their views or not, that's still how a lot of the public sees it.
And that's the role that's what when I say I speak on behalf of the Plattsburgh Police Department, my
Yeah.
face is out there. I'm the one that represents them. That is how I feel, and that is the position that I would expect. That I cannot imagine another officer working here would have a different opinion about that killing. That when we as police officers look at use of force incidents, and our brains are always working, because this is one of the most tense parts of being a police officer, is being judged by your inaction or your action.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, we're always evaluating. Are we doing it the right way? The nuances of case law when it comes to use of force, sometimes they're very gray. Sometimes they are completely black and white. And in this case, it's a very black and white, and I don't mean to say it,
I understand.
I should use a different, it is a very cut and dried viewpoint of that use of force. That use of force in no shape or form would ever be justified. That specific use of force that Chauvin used. And that's ultimately what we rely on is, it's not a justified use of force. The fact that he died as a result of that unlawful use of force, that's when the shock sets in. It's hard to watch that.
Yeah. Well, moving on. In a series of interviews with the North Country Public Radio back in 2016, Sheriff's Lieutenant Nicholas Leon expressed that he doesn't believe racism is a big issue in the North Country, and that racial bias doesn't permeate policing in the North Country. And Sheriff David Favro expressed that racism is largely a thing of the past, and that it was a battle that was fought decades or even centuries ago, and that people need to get over it. And he seemed to basically equate racial tension and racism with slavery. He brings up slavery a lot in that interview. That's one of the few statements I can find from local law enforcement about race and racial tension in our country. And that's a thing that people were asking me to speak on with you is, do you think that it's possible that racial bias does permeate policing in the North Country? And do you also think it's possible that we didn't actually conquer racism centuries ago?
So I'll answer the second one first. I think that a casual look at the state of our country, I think that we would be naive to say that we have conquered racism. That's a personal feeling. I don't know. Again, I don't know if I'm the best person to be answering that question either.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that just as a citizen of the United States, I don't think that it's something that we've conquered as a society.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a thing of the past. That's.
Yeah, I would agree.
So your first question, could it be something that permeates?
Yes, racial bias. Can that permeate law enforcement in the North Country?
So what I would say to that is, while it's something that I would hope and pray does not, I think that is something that could. It's dependent on a lot of circumstances and factors that people change. Who someone is when they're born isn't someone who they are when they graduate high school or graduate college or start a different job or live in a certain community. So it'd be really naive for me to say that it's not something that could permeate or change a person over time.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair. Those same interviews featured statements from people of color in the North Country whose experiences did directly conflict with the statements made by the sheriff's office. And even in this last week, talking to local people, um, or just looking online, earlier today while I was getting ready to do this interview, even Tenzin Dorji, who's running for mayor of Plattsburgh right now, said that when he and his wife were first in the area, they experienced racism from police, and they felt like they were stopped for no other reason than being non-white. And I have talked to a lot of other people, especially recently, who have expressed they've had similar experiences. But I do want to mention that one thing that has been said in almost all those cases is that they do feel that locally they have seen things moving in the right direction. They've seen less and less of that, especially people who've lived in the community for a long time. So I know I'm kind of making just a statement there, but I do want to just acknowledge that it's it's a process.
So this is actually a maybe a similar conversation that I had just today, and it was talking about a different community where I believe it was in New Jersey too, where
Mm-hmm.
in its history it was racial tension, conflicts with police brutality. It was something that it was the poster child for things that are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it took a little bit of a movement, some change in key positions, and some real determination to actually try and change things. And over time, it is a different place. The location escapes me, but that's exactly what you're saying, is that these things take time. It's not something that you can snap your fingers and do, but you have to be determined. You have to have the wherewithal to have the change actually develop over time.
Another common sentiment is that the lack of prosecutions when it comes to cases of police brutality and murder, it leaves people feeling unsafe when dealing with or interacting with local law enforcement. Um, what would you say to people who have a hard time trusting you or your fellow officers, and what is being done to maintain or strengthen a connection between police and the community?
This is a great question. Um, the part about the lack of prosecution or delayed prosecutions, uh, verdicts that make people wonder how a jury arrived at a verdict, that's a complicated thing to explain. Um, from where I see those, there are certain immunities that are given based on a couple of it's a pronged test,
Mm-hmm.
but there are some immunities that are given when officers use certain amounts of reasonable force under certain conditions, that they are granted immunity. And that doesn't coincide with if you were to do the same thing. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the disparity between when people try to understand, well, this officer shot that person,
Mm-hmm.
and under circumstances that a person would wonder, oh, that looks bad. And then ultimately, and I'm making up a hypothetical situation, but we've seen evidence of this,
Mm-hmm.
and there is no indictment, there is a decline to prosecute, or there is a verdict that is rendered not guilty. You know, these are the things that they're always unique to the particular circumstances of whatever occurred. I would go back to the initial prosecutor that announced the arrest for murder of Chauvin.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that arrest in that amount of time was the fastest that they had ever charged a police officer in Minnesota. That things appear to be changing over time. I mean, if you go back to the Rodney King arrest and the verdict rendered from those officers that ultimately led to the riots.
Yes.
They were found not guilty of assault, serious assault. And that baffled people because ultimately a jury made up of peers is what decides those things. You see this, so you see this changing over time, and we're talking about the early 90s to present day. People get to decide with their votes and their voices, and it takes consistency. That if a person doesn't like the way things are, well, they have an opportunity. It's not a quick process, but they voice their displeasure, and ultimately they vote with how they feel. A difficult thing to answer, but
that's
I
fair.
can see why that is how people look at it and try to wrap their heads around why is this different for a police officer and a regular citizen.
But I mean,
So
so you're saying that there is, you know, even within the legal system, there are certain protections and certain laws and immunity that those laws are subject to change over time if people were able to change them.
they are. I'll give you a perfect example. So early days of tasers, departments don't really have a strong, and I say departments generally, departments don't have a strong policy or any policy on the usage of taser. And in a specific case, a woman is stopped for not wearing a seatbelt. She's, you know, argumentative, not compliant with the officer, and the officer says, "Get out of the car." She says, "I'm not getting out of the car," and he uses a taser on her. So one has to ask, is that a justified use of force? No. And courts over time, they say no. So there was no policy in place. The officer might, you know, from a legal perspective, he should have known, but didn't know because there was no clearly established law at the time or case law. And that one is the one that makes the case law. So after that, that precipitates the departments must have a policy on the usage of tasers, for instance. There will not be that usage. That's not a justified use of force based on the severity of the crime. So for a traffic violation, that amount of force isn't justified. The severity of the crime always has to be factored into the usage of force. And going to the Chauvin, into Chauvin's unjustified use of force, the severity of the crime, passing a forged or a counterfeit $20 bill, allegedly. He was handcuffed. He was probably intoxicated or impaired based on accounts. What danger did he pose to those four officers? And then the use of that force, which in a lot of places is very, very contested, whether what amounts to a horribly applied chokehold, that in some places is deadly force. I can tell you for the Plattsburgh Police Department, not that specific knee to the neck, because I don't know how that would be considered an appropriate, an approved hold.
Mm-hmm.
But anything involving that, some sort of chokehold, has to meet the deadly force threshold, because it's a danger when not properly applied. It's a dangerous use of force. So in our policy, unless it's being used as deadly force, that won't be used. So, we're talking about something completely different in a different department, different sizes, different states. But just looking at that use of force it's hard to understand why that was used in the way that it was. And ultimately leading to a death it's hard to fathom.
So, what do you say to community members who are struggling with trusting police locally in the face of events like this?
You have to do the work before things flare up. And one of the things that when I got the opportunity to be appointed as the chief, one of the things that was presented to me very early on was the forming of a community center of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
We call it a different name, but for all intents and purposes, that's what people call it. That's what we call it. It's what it's known as. And the assigning of a police officer out of regular patrol duties to be a community outreach officer. That's where it starts, is telling your community this type of policing, this community policing, is important to us, because we think that it is what establishes the very foundation of trust. Trust is not easily earned. You have to mean it, and you can't half-ass it, and it has to be transparent. That's what we've tried to do with that. And I think that people were skeptical at first, and rightfully so, because
Yeah.
naturally people are skeptical. But ultimately, you have to earn the trust. That's where you start, and where it goes from there is just consistency and honesty.
So, are you're referring to the substation on Margaret Street?
Right.
I was told that recently it's being affected by city budget cuts. Is that? Can you speak on the current state of that operation?
Yes. So about a month ago, we have 3 dispatchers that were furloughed
Mm-hmm.
for 3 months, and we had to reassign that officer to regular patrol duties again to fill that hole. So we aren't able to staff the community center or have a presence there. Hopefully we can when things resume, potentially, but
Mm-hmm.
but currently that's the status of it.
So are they furloughed? That's part of the city's COVID response and budget
Yes.
cuts. Okay. Um, Something that we've seen pop up a lot more in recent years are accounts of police officers engaging in racist or sexist or otherwise divisive behavior on social media. There's been exposés on all sorts of Facebook groups or posts or officers having sort of secondary accounts where they act under some sort of pseudonym. Uh, People are asking if the social media accounts of local law enforcement are monitored in any way.
If they're personal accounts, we don't have any sort of judicial oversight over that or organizational oversight over that. But I can tell you that there's accountability when it comes to what you say, even as a private citizen, because we're still identified as police officers, and that's not a trait that we can have as police officers here. That's I wouldn't consider that a great answer because we're talking about personal accounts, probably.
Yeah,
So
they are personal accounts.
So those things come when they're shared.
Okay.
If they are in fact brought to our attention, they would certainly get addressed.
So it'd be complaint driven if that sort of thing were to appear in the community.
In that case, yes.
Okay. Are local officers equipped with body cameras?
Our department is not.
Okay.
We had gone through a trial program to determine the feasibility of it, and I'll just give you the honest answer. It was really, really expensive, and we would not have been able to support it from a financial and logistical angle. Just the amount of data that would be stored,
Mm-hmm.
it would have been, we wouldn't have been able to sustain it. We do have mobile video recorders in our patrol vehicles, so we do have some ability to have video with officer interactions, and that's also to protect the officer too. I mean, it's not it does work both ways. But in the body cam video, that was something that we weren't able to institute here.
Okay. A recent order, very, very recent order in Burlington is requiring officers to intervene when they are witnessing excessive force. And I'm just going to read it verbatim here. All personnel are required to intervene when they witness excessive use of force, misconduct, or another violation of a department policy or rule. De-escalation should always be prioritized in any use of force scenario if safe, and officers must be aware of their own ability to increase the level of force needed, taking care to avoid any unnecessary escalations. And essentially, I've seen a couple other police departments recently put these orders out as sort of temporary orders as the actual policy of the department is updated, because it's not just always an overnight thing, but the orders can be put in place, as a sort of placeholder. People are asking if there is any sort of requirement for officers locally to intervene or report any sort of violation of policy or rule.
I'm just referring to our use of force policy. I'm trying to find any specific language of the de-escalation. We don't have a specifically de-escalation in our policy. We don't have anything explicit about the duty to intervene. I did go to the Minneapolis Police Department site, and in their use of force policy, the very top of it has that wording. And I would assume that was why the officers were fired. Let me just pull it up quick, because that's exactly what it says. It's duty to intervene. It shall be
Yes.
the duty of every sworn employee present at any scene where physical force is being applied to either stop or attempt to stop another sworn employee when force is being inappropriately applied or is no longer required. We don't have anything explicit like that. That in my opinion is not a bad thing. That would be something that it would be very easy to insert into our policy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say it's almost like, how could you push back on that? You know,
Yeah.
are you telling me that you don't want to tell somebody that they're doing the wrong thing? So it seems like a common sense application, but sometimes it needs to be spelled out.
Yeah. I think that's what a lot of places are finding. And I should note that
Yes.
I read a New York Times article that stated that Minneapolis, their department is a model of progressive police reform. That it says here they offered procedural justice as well as trainings for implicit bias, mindfulness, and de-escalation. It They use body cameras. They implemented an early intervention system to identify officers who may be problematic, and they receive training around mental health and mental health crisis intervention, and practices of reconciliation in communities of color. And all of that still didn't save George Floyd's life. And so I don't want to act like policy is the
Oh,
solution.
I get what you're saying.
But I am
There are
being
lots of laws out there.
yeah, I am being
You have to
I am
start
curious about
somewhere,
our
and you have to start with a policy.
yeah. So that brings me to our local use of force policy. Is that publicly available?
It actually is as of today.
Okay. All
If
right.
you go on, so the mayor asked me to provide that. It's nothing that we would. There's nothing secretive in it. It's just not. It's never been publicly available, but
Yeah.
he asked to make it publicly available. I believe he was putting it on the main City of Plattsburgh site, but I can tell you, as of right now, you can go to the City of Plattsburgh, the PD, the police department page, and on the left-hand menu at the very bottom, there's a hyperlink to the use of force policy, which will lead you to a PDF.
Okay.
And that's the policy.
Speaking on our policy specifically, do we go beyond the minimums set by the Supreme Court? Or is it kind of just a standard policy?
I get what you're asking. There are a lot of minimums.
Mm-hmm.
So specific to the use of deadly force.
Yes.
I'm making probably an uninformed answer, but I would say probably not.
Okay.
Because I would say, so this is why I would say that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm familiar with the NYPD use of force policy when it comes to deadly force, specific to using a firearm, the handgun. And in their policy, the last that I was aware of, that the use of deadly force in the NYPD was in defense of yourself or another person, where New York State actual law has a bunch of criteria, certain felonies to terminate or prevent the escape or arrest, like rape first, certain arsons, things like that, where you can use deadly force per the New York State penal law, but that sometimes conflicts with the Supreme Court's it's Tennessee versus Garner decision. So in our policy, we use there are two conditions where you can use deadly force. It's generally speaking.
Okay.
It is the defense of yourself or another person. So if somebody is someone is using or threatening deadly force on another person, even though it's not to me, that would be to terminate that if it was reasonable and it was necessary. It's not always, it's not a pass to use deadly force. There still has to be justifications.
Yes.
So the other one would generally be, it's long, I'll read it. The officer reasonably believes the subject has committed a felony or has attempted to commit a felony involving the infliction or threatened infliction of death or serious physical injury, and the officer reasonably believes that deadly physical force is necessary to effect the arrest of the subject or to prevent the escape from custody, and the officer reasonably believes that deadly physical force is necessary to defend the officer and other person from what the officer reasonably believes to be the use or imminent use of deadly physical force. So a lot of those words, reasonable, necessary, imminent. It's not just checking a box that, well, a person committed an offense or is threatening to commit offense, and therefore I get to use deadly force. It still has to satisfy what the Supreme Court has, in a different case, how reasonable it is and how necessary it is. So that goes into the severity of the crime. Nonviolent crimes, it would be hard to justify deadly force, generally speaking, on somebody that's not actively resisting arrest, committed a nonviolent, passing a counterfeit bill, allegedly. You have to be able to justify especially deadly force, but all uses of force. And it comes down to, what were the conditions? What was presented in front of you as the threat or the threat to the other person? And this is why training is a very, very integral part of this. And with our department, we do twice a year firearms training. And in conjunction with the firearms training, there are realistic applications of a decision-making process of, whether there's a justification or not. It's just not punching holes in a target to get a score to pass or fail. You have to be able to justify in a lot of cases what you're doing. So we go over recent case law, and a lot of these cases, I mean, I was a firearms instructor, and that was one of the things that I participated in the training aspect of what are the recent uses of force that seem to be questionable, and try and work them out, because if we can gain any insight into why that happened and we can prevent it from happening, it stands to reason that you would want to train on those things, because we can just read a policy and say, okay, I know this verbatim, but it comes down to the real world application in a crisis moment of how are you going to respond? Decision making is a very, very key part of all this.
I'm going to be speaking somewhat hypothetically here, um, because I don't think this is something that we could talk about specifically for our community. Um, but I just want to know if you have any sort of thoughts on some cities are divesting from police and putting funds into alternative emergency response programs so that when it comes to things like a drug overdose or domestic violence or sometimes mental health crises or things of that nature, things that aren't necessarily crimes um, outright. you know, uh, do you have any reaction to communities taking that sort of route?
I would need to know more, but I'll try and give you just thoughts.
Yeah, I feel that's all you
Um,
can say right now because I know it's
yeah, no, but
we can't speak specifically about here without.
so I would imagine that the 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 guiding principle for that is putting resources where they're going to be best utilized. So maybe in certain maybe in certain cities with a different size, there are other resources that kind of overlap with police resources, and that's something that can happen more often. And then in certain cases where there is indicators of a crime or there's a need for a criminal investigation, maybe they triage them that way.
Mhm.
Uh, the one that you said that piques my interest is something that I'm aware of that Vermont does, and it comes with a police response to mental health crisis. That's something that I think that there is a better way to do. So
Mhm.
in what you said, I hope this doesn't come off as disingenuous, but I don't think that police are the best responding agency all of the time for people in mental health crisis. And I would say that by reviewing a lot of case law and and seeing use of force where the police sometimes provoked a situation that resulted in a deadly force scenario.
Yes.
And 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 uh, that is something that I think that you were looking into with our department. There was a in 1995 there was a particular incident that uh, was very similar to that,
Mhm.
um, and and that was a tragedy that affected those officers still to this day. It's you you progress in ways and you learn from things as both a mental health partner and law enforcement. Um, but ultimately, what they do in Vermont in some areas of Vermont
Mhm.
is a person. So a typical call. I shouldn't say typical. I don't want to. There are sometimes a person will call the police department and say, "I'm thinking about killing myself." Under provisions of the mental hygiene law, as a police officer, I can make a mental hygiene arrest, and that amounts to taking somebody to a local hospital or facility for a crisis evaluation.
Mhm.
So it's not an arrest where you go to court, but in terms of depriving that person of their liberty to move freely, it constitutes an arrest. But ultimately, it's to make sure that the person is safe, or a person on the other end would be safe if the person was making homicidal threats and was mentally ill. But but that is not always the best remedy or solution for that. That a person might just be having a bad day and just needs to talk. And the last thing that they want to do is talk to an officer in a uniform that's just come off of 3 calls in a row where he was screamed at and might not have the best patience, when patience is the thing that that person in a moment of crisis needs. So a trained counselor is probably more appropriate, but it does get into areas where it might not be completely safe for a counselor to enter a home of somebody where there's a lot of unknowns. So there might need to be a law enforcement component to keep the person safe, but in terms of the person responding, a police officer might not always be the best person suited for that.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
I can see why that might be the case. I've only seen it in terms of mental health.
Yeah. It's somewhat of a controversial idea to some people, but I do think that as we look more critically at situations like that, I think people see exactly what you're saying. Is like maybe sometimes there is a person with different skills or different training that would be better suited to respond to a certain type of situation. So, um, we'll leave it at that. But that is something that I'm curious about. I'm curious about looking at other cities that have been able to find ways to look at situations and see if maybe, are we responding to them in the best possible way for the health of the community.
So if I could just follow up just 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So I was at a conference where I heard the police department in question over in Vermont talk about this, and they talked about how it was presented to them and how widespread the officers were. They rejected it. They didn't think it would work. And within a year's time, there was so much buy-in because they actually got to see it work the way it was intended to work. And it made things better. It established a better relationship with people that are mentally ill and the police, that they weren't there to haul them off to the hospital or use force that might not have to be used.
Yeah.
And ultimately that's what it is. So it was interesting to hear firsthand how people within a police department were skeptical, and over time they all saw how it worked well.
That's good to hear. Why did you become a police officer?
I love the direct question. I have somewhat of an easy answer. I wanted to be able to help people. I know that's it's very general, but that was really the most attractive part of being appointed as chief, is that I really got to have a hand in decision making on what could potentially help people. The quickest answer is, ask the chief. And if it's something that is worthwhile, it gets supported. But that's what this was for me. It wasn't something that I really thought I would get into. But ultimately, that's what my personality is. That's what drew me into it.
So there are protests and demonstrations planned for this weekend here in the city of Plattsburgh, and I think we're currently in our 8th day of larger protests and riots around the country right now. Personally, I expect things to remain peaceful in Plattsburgh, but people are having a discussion right now over whether or not they feel that police should be invited to or even allowed to march alongside protesters. I'm curious what your take is on that. If you can, if you can see both sides of that, or if you lean one way or another.
So I'll tell you exactly what I expressed to the organizers of the march happening this Saturday. I'm very grateful that we have an open line of communication with them, and we're able to be able to support what they're doing while trying to make sure that everyone is safe. What I told them was, I would gladly accept an invitation to march, walk, whatever is deemed appropriate. But the last thing I'm going to do is disrespectfully bully my way into marching without an invitation. So it's a I would respectfully stay away. We're still going to, as a department, make sure that safety is paramount for the protesters. But ultimately, I want to make sure that it is something, a consensus amongst the protesters, that it's something that they want.
Yeah, I think a consensus is what's needed.
I agree, and I do. I'm not insensitive to the fact that there are different sides of that. That you have some people vocally saying it would be a good thing for the police to march with us, and then you have other people that are just like, no, we're marching to protest the police as a whole, and it seems a little weird that we would have them there in the march itself.
Yes.
So that's my opinion, is that I expressed that I would support them in whatever way the consensus goes.
Okay. Well, and that's all the questions I have right now. I do appreciate you again reaching out and being, not just willing, but asking to speak with me publicly like this. And I do want to say, I don't think that this is any sort of this is no great thing that we're doing right now. You know what I mean? I think that sometimes when interactions between the police and the community are civil and friendly, it's seen as some sort of incredible act of greatness rather than just
Right.
What should be the standard. So I don't want to I don't want to act like this is any wonderful thing we're doing other than having a candid dialogue as community members should be able to have with one another. And I also want to acknowledge that there are a lot of people in the area who have a lot of resentment toward police, or there's a lot of racial tension, or a lot of healing that needs to happen in this country, but in this community as well. And I just want to acknowledge that people are holding on to a lot and experiencing a lot. And if anything, I would hope that this dialogue could at least push things somewhat in the right direction. But I don't want to blow its effectiveness out of proportion at the same time.
Right. I appreciate you saying that. Something that I think it kind of goes by the wayside in other cases. I mean, you can see this with whatever side you fall on with the national discussion of, the ability to possess firearms in response to mass killings in schools, and there's always a discussion about what we need to do, and then the next news cycle occurs, and then it's like we're on to whatever else. And I would say that this seems a little different, and if it's something that the public wants to change, that's something that needs to keep on going. That it can't be abandoned because it's too difficult or there's barriers to it. I mean, change happens because people are persistent. I would hate to see a lot of work done on people's part to protest the way that has been done, for it to just get eclipsed by the next news cycle.
I completely agree. And, I think ultimately my hope in even having this sort of dialogue is that, I believe Plattsburgh is small enough that it's much easier to be a representation of those changes we want to see in the country or in any sort of policy or anything. I think it's a lot more achievable in a community of this size. And I would hope that Plattsburgh could be an example to other places, whether that's just so that someone can cite it as some sort of precedence, or if it's, just an inspiration or an anecdote. I mean, whatever overall impact is, I do think that if people want to see change in a community like this, I think it's much more achievable than it might be in other places, and I think that we should not take that for granted and continue pushing.
Right. I mean, these are the basic principles of community policing. The community gets to be an active participant in what they want policed. I mean, absent chaos and disorder, community policing at its foundation is having the community as an active participant.
Well, I think that's everything for right now. Thanks again for speaking with me.
No, I appreciate it. The one thing that I appreciate getting called out. It is not that I was shying away from a comment, but that genuinely, I didn't want to appear like, oh, look at how I feel about this, because I don't know.
Yeah.
But you made a point. I mean, your point. You made a point.
If people don't know, I essentially, I do think that the actions of one officer, whether we like it or not, it reflects on all officers to much of the public.
It can't be disregarded.
Yeah. So I do appreciate you heeding the call, and I understand. It is something where I don't know how to speak on these sorts of things through what platforms I have always, because I think we're all I think we're all going through a bit of that in some way, where it's uncharted territory for a lot of people, even though these issues aren't anything new. I think a lot of people are navigating that, maybe for the first time in their personal or professional lives, and it's something that you want to make sure that you're handling not only tactfully, but not doing something that's going to set anything back.
Right.
So, all right. Any other comments before we end this?
Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you for.
The people that will see this are, I think the people that were expressing those things to you, I would suspect. So that having the ability to speak to them all at once is what I appreciate.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.